Do you have me now? I think we do. Okay. Do we have good comms now, Brian? All right. Looks good. All right. Apologies for that. We did a test before we started the briefing here, and everything worked fine, but as usual, the devil is in the details. We'd like to start out with this slide to respond to some questions that we've had from a number of folks. The first is, are we going to have to go out and learn PAVER and do PCI surveys to implement these business rules? And in all bases right now have a PCI survey that was completed for their airfield. Now, some of them are a year or two old. That's true. But we should have data for every single airfield. We do not have data for every single road and parking, for the road and parking at every single base, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. There will be no more centralized PCI survey program. We've had that question come up from quite a number of folks, and right now it's our intention to continue the airfield payment evaluation program on a 4-year cycle, and that looks fairly certain. Brian Lee and myself are working diligently to try and continue to maintain funding to do the road and parking PCI program as well, so that that'll be something that we're doing on a 4-year schedule as well. At least trying to complete the linear segmentation process and so forth. We understand that, and we hope that you will understand that this is an evolving process. There's a lot of moving parts. We've generated this spreadsheet that we're going to show you from all of the existing PAVER databases. There's likely going to be some issues here and there with the data, possibly with some of the algorithms and the processes that we're using. So we're looking at this from the perspective that we put a lot of work into it. We think it's pretty good, but undoubtedly there's going to be some adjustments that we need to make as we move through the implementation. And we hope that you'll bear with us as this process does evolve. A lot of questions about PAVER. PAVER 7.0 standalone was just released. The previous version, 6.5.7, many of you have that installed. The certification for that runs out in March, and we hope to have certification for PAVER 7 in place by the time certification runs out for 6.5.7. Later this year, we are going to have PAVER 7 web version that will be something a bit more like what you have with Builder. And we will have a centralized database that will be serving up, where folks at each of the bases can access that data online without having to install PAVER on your machine. I've had questions about the suspense for returning the completed spreadsheet that we're going to show you today, and we didn't want to try and override MAGCOM authority or anything. So essentially, we're allowing the MAGCOMs to set the suspense dates to the bases. I say allowing. We're asking the MAGCOM to set the suspense dates to the bases for return of those spreadsheets, but it's not going to be later than the BCAMP due date. Okay. Had a number of questions about why some of these cells are locked. Primarily, we want to try and maintain control of the segmentation and the current condition and deterioration data. That's one of the big things. But we also want to ensure that when we get the data back from the bases, that we can use that data to update our PAVER databases in our Rollup PAVER database in a controlled manner. And therefore, many of the things we're asking the bases to go ahead and provide any corrections that they have in the remarks column that we'll show you in a little bit. Next slide, please. Okay. This is just a list of some of the resources that are out there that are available to you. I think in previous presentations you've seen the overarching business rule processes, so I'll focus on the TNAP resources. The airfield roll-up PCI spreadsheets that we're talking about were already sent to the MAGCOMs, and the MAGCOMs will be forwarding those out to the bases. However, those spreadsheets are available at that link there if for some reason you need them. You can download PAVER at that link. There's a process for actually doing the install and getting the authorization and whatnot that's outlined in a document that we posted to our COP, and you'll see that link later on here. If you need training, the PAVER manual and training slides are available at that link. If you need access to your payment evaluation reports, we have those online as well. And what you'll find at that link is the PDF of the report, drawings, and the PAVER database. When you received your PCI report, you should have received a disk that has actually all of the source documents, so the Word documents that went in to generating that report, and those might be of use to you as well, although they're not posted. But if you don't have your disk and you need access to those files, I'll show you later on. We'll talk about that a little bit and give some contact information on how to get that information to you if you need it. AFI-13-41 pavement evaluation, and the unified facilities criteria for doing PCI surveys. And there's a new ETL that is not quite finalized yet. We expect it to be posted here in the next week or so, and essentially that's an ETL that was developed with the help of a number of your MAGCOM pavement engineers to implement preventive maintenance plan procedures for airfields. Next slide, please. Okay, these are the things that we want to go over today. I'm probably going to handle I will handle the payments requirement scoring worksheet, and Mr. Lee is going to handle how to use the information once you've got the worksheet done. Next slide, please. Okay, why did we build this spreadsheet? Primarily for some of the questions that we had earlier on was, do we have to learn PAVER and be able to implement these business rules? And so we wanted to try and make it easy for the folk, help the installations and MAGCOMs calculate the scores in a consistent manner, and to automate that process of computing the not only the probability and the MDI, which are not too difficult, but the savings to investment ratio computation that's outlined in ETL 1403. That's a little bit more complicated, and it would have been somewhat difficult to try and have the bases do. In addition, we want to collect the data from the bases to update our roll-up database and try and keep things as up-to-date as possible when we're going through this decision process. What's in it? So roll-up PCI data from the PAVER databases for every base from their last PCI survey. Okay, the sheet does include columns for linear segmentation data and for engineering assessment data. Now, the PAVER databases that have been generated since we started the linear segmentation process have some of the linear segmentation data, and we'll be asking you to verify those. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the PAVER databases do not currently have the engineering assessment data that we've been including in your report, and that's been more of a manual process that was done by our consultants or the APE team when they did your report. So what we're trying to do is modify PAVER to where we can input that engineering assessment data. And to be quite honest with you, we really did not have the time to go through report by report and try and update the databases. So we're asking your help in populating this spreadsheet with this data, and then we will use that to update the databases. And I already talked about the SIR computation. Once again, the data is at that link there. Now let's talk a little bit about how to use it. Next slide, please. Okay, when you open up the spreadsheet, it should open up to this instructions tab. And essentially, we've given you a little bit of background information on what's in the spreadsheet, what some of the limitations are with the data that we have in there, where we're going with it, and kind of the objective of this effort. Next slide, please. Okay, still on the instructions tab, further down, we are actually using color codes for different columns, and we want to be able to highlight cells that really require no input from you. It's just data from the PAVER database, and then there are cells where you will be entering the data in different categories, and these color codes will describe to you what those categories are. Next slide, please. Okay, further down, still on the instructions tab, we actually talk about each individual cell and what data is contained in that cell. And it gives you a little bit of insight into the cells where we don't really need you to do anything, and it also talks about if we do need you to input something, what data is it that we are asking you to input and where you can find it. Next slide, please. All right. So we also, in the second tab, provide an example, and I'm going to be talking about this example in a little bit more detail later. But essentially, we went through kind of step by step and have numbered instructions here that will give you some information on what you need to input in addition to the information that we had on the instructions tab. Next slide, please. Okay, the next tab that we have in the spreadsheet is the Rollup Requirements tab. This is the sheet that you're actually going to be doing the updates on. And you can see right now it's the columns aren't populated for like the FOD aircraft group index, the FOD potential rating, and so forth. And we'll be talking a little bit more about some of those cells here in the next couple of slides. Next slide. All right. Okay, I think we jumped around a little bit here. All right, so actually here on this cell, we are we'll go ahead and jump into entering data, the linear segmentation data, into the spreadsheet. So what we're asking you to do is if the cells have data in it from your linear segmentation effort during the last PCI inspection, we're asking you just to verify it to make sure there's been no changes. If there's no data, we're asking you to enter your latest data in the cell. And essentially what you will need to do is use the pavement facility map that was developed per the General Buyer's Tasker that came out in April of 2013. You will also need to be looking at your pavement section map from your last PCI report, and you will likely find ACE's real property data helpful in correlating between facility number, RPU ID, and category code. I will tell you this, that if you have not had, if you've just completed your pavement facility map, but you haven't had a PCI to complete the segmentation process, you're going to find issues where the information doesn't align real well. What we would ask you to do is do the best you can. It may not be perfect. If you need assistance, you can either call your MAGCOM pavement engineer to help sort out what we need to enter there, or you can call AFCAC, myself specifically, and we can try and walk through what you ought to do in specific instances. Now, any disconnects that we identify as part of this process, we are going to update and kind of resolve during the next PCI survey or structural evaluation. Next slide, please. Okay, and I mentioned quite a bit of data that you would use for the linear segmentation data update. Here's just a couple of screenshots. So once again, your pavement facility map from GeoBase, the one that you all have developed here over the last couple of months. The pavement section map from the PCI report. Okay, and then there's a real property data report from ACES that kind of correlates between RPUID, facility number, and then gives you what the CAT code is. So you can use all of these different data sources to try and to update the data in the spreadsheet. Next slide, please. Okay, let's walk into this example here. All right. The first thing that we're going to ask you to update, or the second thing we're going to ask you to update after the segmentation data, is to pull in the engineering assessment data from your last PCI report. So in this particular instance, I'm highlighting the FOD aircraft group and the FOD potential rating. Okay, next slide. And what you're going to do is go to your PCI report, and it's typically in the E appendix, and you will see a series of tables there that list critical aircraft and the potential rating for each individual section. And essentially, we're just asking you to copy and paste that data into each corresponding cell for each section in the spreadsheet. If you're uncertain, if they in this particular instance they listed the T-38 as the critical aircraft, and really what you're going to be entering into the spreadsheet is the critical aircraft group, and so that'll be either F-16, KC-135, or C-17, and we have a pull-down menu that has one of those three choices. And if they have not listed one of those aircraft groups in the critical aircraft column of your PCI survey, you can use this table from AFI 32-1041 to determine which group your aircraft is in. And in this case, this base had a T-38, and it was in the F-16 aircraft group. Next slide, please. All right, once you have the FOD aircraft group and FOD potential rating input, you'll want to input the SI, and that's structural index, critical aircraft, and the structural index ACN to PCN ratio. And next slide. And it's a similar to with the FOD index. You'll go to Appendix E, and you'll find the critical aircraft listed in the critical aircraft column, and then you'll see the ACN to PCN ratio listed. Oftentimes in the report, it will say ACN divided by PCN, or it may say index or structural index. In this case, it says index. If you have any question about which column it is, give your MAGCOM pavement engineer or myself a call, and we can help you sort that out very quickly. Next slide. All right, and then finally, for the engineering assessment data, we're asking you to update the friction index. And you will note that in this example, the friction index block is blank. And that is because the only cells that we are going to populate for the friction index are the runway cells, or the cells associated with the runway. Next slide. And this shows you a good example of what I'm talking about. In this table, once again, out of the Appendix E of your PCI report, you will see that the overruns are grayed out. There's no friction index rating, and the same will be true for your aprons and your taxiways. And you'll only have values here for the runway. Now, in many reports, you'll actually see a friction index number associated with each section, and that's what we're looking for. If you run into a situation like this, where they put good, fair, or poor, then we're going to ask you to populate a 0.5 for good, a 0.45 for fair, and a 0.39 for poor. And these values correlate to the ratings that we have in AFI 32-1041 Airfield Pavement Evaluation. Next slide, please. Okay, once you've entered that data, you will we will have the probability of failure, the adjusted MDI, and the savings to investment ratio columns will all populate automatically. And as you can see here, they're all color-coded purple. And if you go back to the first slide with instructions, it'll show you any column that has a purple color code are computations that we're performing automatically that you will not have access to. Although the instructions will tell you what the formula is that we used for those computations. Okay, let's see, once the EA data is populated, okay, so you get your adjusted PCI, all right, and the adjusted PCI, for your information, is simply the FOD deduct minus the structural deduct minus the skid deduct. And I won't go into what each one of those are. You can see the computations for those in either AFI 32-1041 or in the instructions on this sheet. But essentially what it is, it's taking the PCI that is projected for 2015, and it is adjusting it downward to account for any issues that you may have with friction, FOD, or your structural index. That adjusted PCI is then used to compute the probability of failure. And in this column here, we're populating that using the computation shown in the lower right-hand corner, which is essentially the score matrix from the business rules in Appendix B. Okay. And then finally, the score column, which is meant to help you kind of rack and stack your requirements, and it is just the sum of the probability of failure score, the adjusted MDI, savings to investment ratio, and gives you that number in the score column and allows you to kind of determine which one of these sections have the highest risk. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay. And here we've taken some of that data and just tried to compare it to that risk matrix that we have in the business rules. You'll note that there's some minor differences in terminology between what you see in the business rules and what you see on this sheet. And I've highlighted adjusted MDI. Now, the adjusted MDI that we're using in this TNAP process is a little bit different than the adjudicated MDI that you're seeing over there in the left margin under consequence of failure. So they're slightly different processes used there, but essentially the adjusted MDI is the MDI for that pavement, whether it's a runway, a apron, or a taxiway. And if a primary pavement, we're just using the MDI. If it's a secondary pavement, we multiply the MDI by 0.9. If it's a tertiary pavement, we multiply the MDI by 0.7. And the objective here is really trying to get better stratification on the requirements. If we have just the MDI for all of your pavements on your airfield are not adjusted at all, you're going to have everything grouped together, even though that pavement may not be important to you. And then we've got an example here of how the results that we get in our spreadsheet kind of match up with the matrix. So in this particular instance, we have a probability of failure score of 43. And so you come in on the x-axis and go up, and then you have a consequence of failure score on the left column, but in this case we use adjusted MDI rather than calling it consequence of failure, since that's the only parameter that we're really looking at for the TNAP AMP process here. And you'll see that we have a value of 86. So that puts that particular section in the moderate risk category. Next slide, please. Okay, the final tab that we have is the, let me back up a second here. Also on this spreadsheet, you're going to see cost data, and that'll be over kind of on the right margin of the spreadsheet. And the costs that were generated from the PAVER databases are parametric costs. And so essentially we use means to generate the cost of different repair types, and then we do a cost by condition curve for each individual base. So the costs that are here use that process. Now, as you are probably aware, parametric cost estimates have a certain level of accuracy. If you want to develop a more accurate cost estimate for that particular requirement, you can use the extrapolated distress table from your reports, from your PCI report, which is shown in the lower part of the slide here. And it'll tell you the quantity of each type of distress and will help you determine how many repairs of each type of distress you're going to make, the square footage, the linear footage, etc., to help come up with a little bit better cost estimate than what we did using the parametric process in PAVER. And if you do that, if you choose to do that, you will go ahead and update this total cost column to reflect the cost that you generated in your cost estimate. Next slide, please. Okay, and the kind of the final tab that we have on our spreadsheet is the report view. And once you've populated all of those changes in the Rollup Requirements spreadsheet, this tab here will automatically populate with those to reflect those changes. And the intention here is that you're going to use the data in the requirements spreadsheet to kind of rack and stack your requirements and then combine those requirements into projects. Okay? And once you've created that project, we're asking that you copy and paste the values that are in this spreadsheet into ACEs so that we have a way of seeing the sections, the information on the sections you included in that specific project. Okay, and I think at this point, Brian, that's a good time for us to transition to you. Let's go to the next slide. Yes, exactly. So Brian, I'm going to mute and go over to you.
All right, thank you, George. All right, the previous slide showed how several fields that you would copy and paste into this pavements project worksheet. So I went ahead and did that for a number of requirements just for an example. And when you paste those things into the spreadsheet, there's math built into this worksheet that will automatically calculate costs for all the different items. The one thing you'll have to do in that other sheet is add the square footage of work, either in that sheet or this sheet. And it'll automatically calculate the weighted average condition index that you see near the bottom, as well as the weighted average MDI and the total cost of the project. And you'll be entering this data into ACES, and the easiest way to copy in the ACES is copy and paste. You drag your cursor across the header and those cells down below, and you can just copy and paste it in the ACES. And here's some screenshots of where in ACES this data will go. So you start out with the programming screen, you click on that text box, it opens up the second screen to the right. It shows you the project text box, and you'll paste it into the description field. Okay, I just got some input that we're getting new guidance on what's going to be posted into this text field.
Same thing? It'll be the remarks field instead of the description.
Okay, it's going to be the remarks field instead of the description field. So,
Crap.
no. Okay, next slide. Okay. This screen shows where the probability of failure, consequence of failure, and SIR are pasted into AFCAMP. You go to the programming field or screen, click on the other costs, and it brings up the project other costs screen. You click in the item name box, and then that enables you to click the down arrow, and then you can select the probability of failure, consequence of failure, and SIR field. And then you paste into the amount column the actual values. And as you can see there, ACES PM turns the values into dollars. Don't worry about that, it's okay. That will not affect how the Air Force uses the data. And at this point, that's the end of the slideshow, and we are available to take questions.
All right, we have a few questions so far that have come in. If you have additional questions, please type them in the chat box and we'll do a good job or do the best we can at answering them. The first one is, can the PAVER cert to operate be posted? My computer folks will not install the software without it.
George, I asked you, is there any issue with posting that certificate on the web?
No, not at all. In fact, right now, if you look at the PAVER download site, the certification from AFNIC is listed there. Since we did that certification, there's been some new rules on the approval to operate. And essentially what it gets down to is each individual MAGCOM and each individual base can actually do a test on PAVER before they'll allow it on their system. And what I'm working on right now as part of the certification process for PAVER 7 is to get to the folks at Space Command that are kind of the central focal points for specific commands to see if we can get their checklists that are used by the bases so that we can populate those with the information, and then we would put the what I call the certificate of net worthiness on there like we have in the past, but we would also add this checklist that you can hand to your base level IT folks, then, and they can have that information available, and it would hopefully expedite the process of getting the software installed. Hope that helps.
The next question is, if emission changes, i.e. F22 to F16, has occurred since the last structural, do you want the updated aircraft reflected?
Well, in the particular example you talked about there, those are both in the same aircraft group for the FOD index, so that won't be an issue there. But if there was a change in the aircraft for the structural index, then from F16 to F22, then yes, we would like you to update that information and note it in remarks if you would. So let me clarify.
The Fairchild Air Force Base AFCAMP friction evaluation report only had MU meter friction coefficients listed and not friction index per se. What do we put in the friction index cell on the spreadsheet?
Okay, those MU meter readings are the friction index. So unless I'm misunderstanding what they're saying, those are the numbers that you would want to have. Typically, it's going to be a number between like 0.30 and 0.7, somewhere in that range. And what I would say is if the POC there at Fairchild would like to contact me after this, I can take a look specifically at what's going on with their data and give them some guidance.
We have some excess pavements that ought to be less than tertiary. Will a lower MDI be established?
Very good point that I missed. Okay, we have actually in the spreadsheet have 4 categories, and if you have it's primary, secondary, tertiary, and unused. So if you have unused pavements, then that will assign an MDI of 0 to those pavements when the computation is done.
And George, is there a link or somewhere where the draft ETL 14.3 is posted so that folks can check it out?
I thought I had a link on that on the second page, and it's on either the whole building design guide, or we'll have it also posted on our AFCAC website. And if I think we're going back here. Okay. Yes. Okay. So right under there, ETL 14-3. Once again, it's not published yet. I just got the editorial comments last night, and we're finalizing the last few things, and then we should be able to get it published in short order. But you'll be able to get it at that link right there.
All right. The next question is, where is the pavement facility map available?
Each individual base should have generated their own pavement facility map as part of the General Buyer's April 2013 tasker. So you would, the best source I would say is start with your GeoBase folks. And if for some reason the GeoBase folks do not know what you're talking about, that's kind of a problem at this point, and you'll need to speak with your real property officer and try and track down what the status of the real property map for your particular base is.
Next question said, several of the PCIs, column R on the spreadsheet, don't match the PCIs in our latest report. Should we note that in the remarks?
Okay, so good point. I'm glad you brought that up. So the PCI in your report was as of the date that the PCI was conducted. Okay, and the adjusted PCI that we're using for all of these computations are essentially what we do is we take the PCI as of the date of the inspection, and then we're going to subtract from that the deterioration rate times the number of years since your last inspection. So we're going to be reducing that adjusted 2015 PCI. So if you're talking about the adjusted 2015 PCI, it's unlikely that it's going to match what you have in your report. If you are talking about the actual PCI value that we have in the spreadsheet not matching what you had in your last PCI report as of the date that it was inspected, then that's an issue, and I would ask you to get with me on that.
Next question, is there any relevance of this for bases without flying missions or runways to track the PCI of roads?
Yeah, Brian, I'll go ahead and take this one too. So as we said in the beginning, we really placed a lot of emphasis on airfields in this effort. But as we speak, we're trying to roll out this same process for roads and parking. It's not going to be ready for prime time for the 2015 effort. And if you look at the business rules, Brian has outlined some guidance on how to input information on roads and parking or other non-pavement assets into projects if you have those requirements in the business rules. So I would refer you to the business rules on that. But essentially, you know, if you have a requirement for road and parking pavements and you follow a process similar to this, where you just use the PCI instead of or the FY15 PCI and the MDI, adjusted MDI, to kind of compute your probability of failure and consequence of failure, would be a good way of getting it done. So I know that leaves a little bit of a gap here, and as we said at the beginning, this is not perfect. If you do have some requirements that are showing up high on high on your list of projects, and you want to get some specific advice on it, I would recommend you either contact your MAGCOM pavement engineer or myself, and we can work through it.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Great answer, George. When George and I looked at this program, part of the issue is roads don't typically compete very high in the IPLs, whereas airfield pavements do. So that's why we focused first on airfields and getting our business processes locked in on that. If bases have roads or parking lots that are vital to the mission, as George mentioned, the business rules provide a means to get that, there are procedures in place to get those scored appropriately, as long as the MAGCOMs support the base desires in that area.
And the next question is kind of a follow-on. It says, will AFCAMP eventually have a similar TNAP road pavement spreadsheet? If so, do we have an estimated ETA for that?
And like George said earlier, our goal is to have that ready for next year's rollout of the business rules.
Next question says, typically the MDI for roads and parking lots are way lower than those for airfield pavements, so under the current business rules, they don't have much of a chance of getting funded. Or a statement and a question.
That is a true statement. Typically, the Air Force doesn't place as much importance on roads because if a road starts to fail, you're not going to have a plane fall out of the sky, or you're not going to have a plane have major problems because it hits a pothole in the runway. So as long as we are in a limited funding constrained environment, roads probably are going to have a hard time getting funding. Right. Colonel Meeker just mentioned that that the risk matrix model that we're creating or have created will highlight problematic issues. So when roads start to get to the point to where it's causing significant mission impacts, they will rise up in the scoring and should get funding in the IPL as appropriate.
Next question said, the spreadsheet provided by George to MatchComs doesn't match the one shown in the slides. Can George forward this new spreadsheet?
Yes, and I figured some quick person out there was going to pick up on that. As we thought we had everything nailed down, and in the last minute we received 3 new databases, and we also found 1 or 2 issues with the computations, with the algorithms that I had used in some of the cells. They didn't align with what we have in the business rules exactly. So we've made some adjustments. I'm going to have all of those posted up later today. I have been communicating with the MatchCom pavement engineers, letting them know that there was another version coming out. So we hope to have all that squared away today. And I would like to add one thing on the previous comment regarding roads and parking. And that sounded pretty dismal, that we got no hope. And really, what I would like to say is we've got a team right now that's working on a ETL very similar to the preventive maintenance ETL we have for airfields, but for roads and parking. And it also has a risk analysis in there. And what we're hoping to be able to do is show that by doing preventive maintenance on roads, that there's a significant savings to investment ratio on those. And so that would actually posture some of these road projects a little bit better in the big scheme of things. And one thing that we didn't really talk today was the savings only projects. I don't think we want to get into that right now, but we understand that there's kind of a shortfall there, and we're looking at ways to address that, is what I would like to say.
Next question says, PCN and friction tests are done about every 10 years. Should we assume there is no adjustment between tests?
Excuse me, I had to cough there. Okay, so on PCN, the assumptions that we're making is if you have not reconstructed that section, that there should not be a significant change in the PCN. Okay, if you have reconstructed that section, then we're going to make the assumption that when you designed it, that you designed it adequately to handle the load of your mission aircraft. In other words, it was designed appropriately. So we're going to say that you've got ACN to PCN ratio of 1. I know in the past we've had calls from folks where they say, well, we just did a random slab replacement on our runway. Shouldn't the PCN go up? Well, that's not necessarily the case, depending on the scope and the area which was repaired. So those are really case-by-case basis, and we couldn't predict that in this particular effort. So for the time being, we're just going to ask you to use the PCN that you had on the last structural until such time as we get in there and retest it and update it. If you have a particularly unusual situation and you would like us to do a tabletop to revise your PCN, we have done that in the past for airfields. Friction's a little bit different. The values have a little bit more of a shelf life than the structurals, but as of right now, the best recommendation we have is to continue to use that friction index from the last skid evaluation or friction test evaluation, unless there's some compelling reason that you believe that it's erroneous. And in that case, we would ask you to note that in the remarks, and then we can address it with you.
All right, the next question is, what is the deterioration rate, and is it a single standard number for all pavements, or does it take into consideration factors such as construction, pavement type, age, etc.?
Oh,
Understand the rate is multiplied by the years since the last PCI. However, pavement deterioration versus time is not necessarily a linear relationship.
absolutely correct. So let me talk to you about the deterioration rates that we have in these spreadsheets. So first, the deterioration rate that is listed here are the deterioration rates for each individual base based on the pavement type for that section. Okay, so what we do is let's say base X. We will group all of your concrete pavements and all of your asphalt pavements, and we'll compute a deterioration rate for those pavements. And that's what's going to be in this sheet. And it's going to be different than let's say, it's going to be different from Langley to Scott to Creech. So we've tried to capture those deterioration rates for that specific location at each specific base. Now, the second point that you made was that deterioration rates are not necessarily linear, and that is a true statement as well. And in fact, oftentimes you'll see that the deterioration rate from your last PCI to your current PCI is much different than your deterioration rate from the original construction to the last PCI. And that kind of reflects the nonlinear nature of deterioration. So what we would say here is that we've used the linear deterioration rate since the last PCI, and we realize that it's not perfect. If you have a section that is deteriorating at a much faster rate than what we've used, then that's something that we can address in the remarks and say, you know, we feel it's in much worse case or much worse condition than what would be reflected here, and we will look at those issues on a case-by-case basis and try and assess them. One of the major objectives that we have here is really trying to keep everybody on a level playing field. So that's why we used the rules that we used instead, and why we locked down some of the cells, at least in part, so that we have kind of some control processes here. I've had a number of people call me and say, well, you know, I know what's going on at my base, but what's that guy doing over at base X? And so one of our goals in this whole process is trying to maintain a level playing field to where everybody's playing by the same set of rules. I kind of went beyond the question there, so excuse me on that one, but.
All right, that looks like the end of the questions. So thank you very much. Hopefully this has been helpful to you all. We'll continue to try to make improvements to this program as we learn more as we go down this asset management journey. So thank you very much.